Hi guys, welcome to Commercial Law Tutorials. Law of Purchase and Sale. We have already looked at the definition and the essentials. Today we are moving on to lesson number 2. Duties of the buyer and those of the seller. In this lesson, we'll look at the duties of the buyer, then the duties of the seller, and at the end of the lesson, we'll look at the popular exam questions relating to this lesson. First, the duties of the buyer. Payment of the price. Buyer should make payment according to the terms agreed in the contract. If it's a cash sale, payment should be unconditional. It should be in full and at the time and place agreed in the contract. If payment is by installments, buyer should not default in the payment by installments as agreed until payment is in full. Then, if buyer is paying using a check, the buyer is not freed until the check is met at the bank. Reimbursement of the seller for his necessary expenses. This is in the law of risk. Buyer is expected to pay for any expenses that are accrued from the time of sale to the time of delivery of the mix. For instance, taxes and storage cost before delivery. Those are the fruits of the mix. Acceptance of delivery in both divisible and indivisible deliveries. Buyer should accept delivery on time and at the place agreed in the contract. If delivery is by installment, buyer should accept all the installments on time. For instance, one can make payment for bread in advance for the whole month, and the bread is delivered every day until the month ends. So the buyer will be expected to accept delivery until the month ends. To comply with other obligations stated in the contract is the other duty of the buyer. Buyer should obey any further obligations imposed upon him in the terms of the contract. Those were the duties of the buyer. We are moving on to the duties of the seller. The first one is to preserve the mix until delivery. To deliver the mix, warrant the purchaser against eviction, guarantee the mix as free from latent defects. I'll explain this in detail. First, preserve the mix until delivery. When the sale is just completed, seller has the duty to care and preserve the mix until delivery. Mix should be preserved from damage and deterioration of value until delivery is done. Seller is liable for any loss caused by willful acts or gross negligence before delivery of the mix to the buyer, where delivery is not yet due. So, where delivery has not yet become due, the seller must show standard care and he is liable for any loss if he doesn't take care of the mix before delivered to the buyer. But where delivery has become overdue through the fault of the buyer who has failed to accept delivery on time, there is no longer the duty upon the seller to preserve the mix for the buyer. Seller will only be liable in the cases where, out of his willful acts or gross negligence, he has damaged the buyer's mix. Then the next duty is to deliver the max. Seller must deliver the max in the condition it was at the time of sale. For instance, if the product had other accessories, they should be delivered. For example, a television set and a remote. Seller must deliver all fruits that has been generated from the time of sale to the time of delivery also. This is in the rule of passing of risk. That is, the advantages and disadvantages, they should pass to the buyer. For instance, we have already talked about taxes and the storage costs that accrues from the time of sale to the time of delivery. They should be paid by the buyer. It is one of his or her duty. And also the seller should deliver all the advantages like rentals that have been paid by a lessee at the property from the time of the sale to the time of delivery of a house or a building that have been sold. Seller must also appropriate max before delivery, and the seller must deliver at the proper time and place agreed in the contract. And delivery must be in a way that the buyer is entitled to undisturbed possession of the max. And the delivery should be in accordance with what was agreed in the contract in regards to size, quantity, quality, and other qualifications. If the seller fails to deliver, the buyer has the following remedies. He can claim specific performance, cancellation plus damages. The third duty of the seller is to warranty the purchaser against eviction. Eviction here is referring to undisturbed use of the max. The buyer must enjoy undisturbed and free possession of the max. The seller has the duty also to guarantee the buyer to no disturbance from both the seller himself and any third party. If the buyer is evicted, the seller must compensate the buyer. So, we are saying that the seller guarantees the buyer that seller himself will not disturb the buyer. Seller will defend the buyer against any third party in any legal attempt to evict him. If seller fails to defend the buyer from the third parties, he or she will compensate the buyer for the loss suffered as a result of the eviction. This will not apply when the parties expressly agree that the seller will not be liable should the buyer be evicted, or if the buyer was aware that a third party was the owner of the thing sold. If the cause of eviction arises after the sale and the seller is not fraudulent at all, and by the cause of this measure, for instance, floods and earthquakes. The last duty is to guarantee max is free from latent defects. Latent defects are hidden flaws in the article which are not readily apparent at the time of sale. They can be easily overlooked by a reasonable mere inspection of the product being sold. The warranty against latent defect is implied in all contracts of sale without express agreement between the parties. This duty is discussed in detail in the next lesson on latent and patent defects. The exceptions and remedies for latent defects are in that lesson. Also, in addition to that, more on delivery is in lesson 5. The forms of delivery and the examples as well as cases are in that lesson. Let us now look at the questions. Discuss the duties of the buyer and the seller, showing clearly the obligations and rights in this type of contract. Explain fully the warrant against latent defects and the remedies available. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and like if you haven't done so.